Welcome, my friend. Let everything slow. Before the Elves ever knew civil war, before Ulthuan ever split into two bitter and warring halves, there was a single king who united them all against a horror that nearly ended their whole civilization. Aenarion the Defender, first of the Phoenix Kings, drove back the demons of chaos in an age of ruin so complete that later ages would remember it only as catastrophe, and in doing so, he paid a price that would echo through his own bloodline for every age still to come. Tonight we begin the story of the Sundering, with the first Phoenix King, and the curse his victory left behind. Tonight we sit with Aenarion the Defender, the first Phoenix King of Ulthuan, and the terrible price his victory over chaos would leave upon his bloodline. Tonight we sit with Aenarion the Defender, the first Phoenix King of Ulthuan, and the terrible price his victory over chaos would leave upon his bloodline. A world undefended. When chaos shattered the civilization of the Old Ones, the Elves of Ulthuan found themselves suddenly and terribly undefended, demons ravaging their idyllic island home without mercy. For ages beyond easy counting, the Elves had dwelt upon Ulthuan in a peace few other peoples across the whole of the world could claim to share, taught the secrets of magic by the Old Ones, who had first shaped so much of the world's earliest civilization. Under the gentle rule of the Ever-Queen, they lived unblemished by the kind of woe that had already begun to touch so many other corners of the world. This long and idyllic peace ended the moment chaos tore through the Old One's own great works, unleashing demons of the chaos gods upon a world the Elves had never needed to defend before. Ulthuan, sheltered for so long behind the strength of a civilization greater than its own, found itself suddenly and catastrophically exposed. Demons poured across the island continent, terrorizing a people who had known nothing like this horror in all their long and gentle history. Whatever defenses the Elves might have raised in calmer times proved wholly inadequate against a threat that answered to no ordinary rule of war, a corruption of reality itself, rather than any conventional army an elven prince might have known how to meet in battle. A people who had built their whole civilization upon the assumption that the Old One's protection would endure indefinitely discovered in this collapse how thoroughly that assumption had left them unprepared for its absence. The Elves of Ulthuan had grown skilled in magic and art, and the quiet cultivation of beauty across ages of uninterrupted peace. But this same peace had left them with little practice in the harder disciplines war demands, disciplines their sudden and terrible circumstances now required of them without warning or preparation. This unpreparedness makes what followed all the more remarkable. A people so poorly equipped for the horror now descending upon them might reasonably have been expected to shatter entirely beneath its weight, their idyllic civilization crumbling into the same ruin that had already claimed so much of the wider world, that the Elves instead found, within their own ranks, the strength to answer this catastrophe speaks to something the ages of peace had not entirely erased, a capacity for resolve that had never before been tested by circumstances grave enough to demand it. It was from within this desperate torment that Aenarion rose, a figure who would come to be remembered as the first and greatest of all the Phoenix Kings, the defender whose name would echo through every later age of Ulthuan's long history. What drove this particular elf to answer a catastrophe that had broken so many others? The surviving record does not explain in whole. What is certain is that when the demons came, Aenarion did not break before them as so many others had. What set Aenarion apart from every other elf who faced the same catastrophic invasion and found themselves unable to answer it as he did remains a genuine mystery worth sitting with. whatever quality allowed him to meet horror with resolve rather than despair. It was not a quality the wider elven civilization of Ulthuan had ever needed to cultivate before this crisis arrived. He emerged from an age of unbroken peace bearing a capacity for war that peace itself could never have taught him. A mystery the surviving accounts of his life have never resolved in whole. Content instead to record what he accomplished rather than to explain how he came to be capable of accomplishing it. The Defender rises. Aenarion rallied the scattered elves of Ulthuan beneath a single banner, uniting kingdoms that had never before answered to one ruler, and drove the demonic tide back through victories that would define the whole of his legend. The Elves proclaimed Aenarion the Defender, the blessed Phoenix King of Asuryan, greatest among their gods, and wherever he led, others found the courage to follow. Where he fought, the demonic hordes that had seemed unstoppable only seasons before found themselves, at last, thrown back. This was no small achievement. Ulthuan before Aenarion's rise had never known a single unified rule, its 10 kingdoms governing themselves according to their own separate traditions and their own separate princes. Aenarion united them all beneath his single banner. The first monarch in the whole history of the Elves to claim authority over the entire island continent at once. Mighty heroes rallied to this new king's cause, elves whose names would remain entwined with his legend for as long as the story is told. Calidor, greatest of all elven mages, lent his own considerable power to Aenarion's cause, while countless other warriors and princes set aside whatever rivalries had once divided their separate kingdoms to answer a threat that recognized no such old distinctions. For a time, the whole of Ulthuan stood as one people under one king, a unity born not from ambition or conquest, but from the plain and desperate necessity of survival against an enemy no single kingdom could ever have hoped to face alone. There is something worth marking in how this unity, however genuine and however necessary, remained bound to the crisis that had first demanded it. The 10 kingdoms of Ulthuan did not set aside their old separate identities out of any newfound conviction that unity itself was preferable to their ancient traditions of independent rule. They set them aside because the demonic tide left no other reasonable course available, a practical necessity rather than a considered change of heart. This distinction matters more than it might first appear, for it means the loyalty Aenarion commanded, however genuine in the moment, rested upon foundations that circumstance alone had built, foundations that might prove far less stable once the crisis that first laid them had passed at last. This same unity also demanded something the Elves had never before been asked to grant any single ruler: absolute authority across every kingdom of the island at once, a concentration of power no previous age of Ulthuan's long history had ever required or permitted. Aenarion wielded this authority well in the crisis that demanded it, but the precedent it set, a single king commanding the whole of Ulthuan's strength, would carry consequences neither he nor his people could have anticipated in whole once peace returned and the question of succession came in time to be asked. Consider what it means to be the first to hold any office, however necessary its creation might have seemed in the moment. Aenarion did not merely become a king. He became the very template against which every Phoenix King who followed him would always be measured. His particular strengths and his particular temperament setting expectations no successor could ever hope to match precisely, whatever their own merits might otherwise have offered. This precedent would prove, in ways Aenarion himself could never have foreseen, to shape the fate of his own children more than any other legacy his reign left behind. This unity, however hard won and however necessary, carried within it the seeds of what would later unravel it entirely. A people accustomed to their own separate rule, bound together only by the crisis that made unity essential, would not necessarily remain bound once that crisis had passed. Aenarion's victories saved Ulthuan from annihilation, but the peace his triumph purchased would prove, in the ages still to come, far more fragile than the war it ended. The sword and the price. To complete the great working that would banish chaos from the world at last, Aenarion took up the cursed Sword of Khaine, a weapon whose power came bound to a price that would follow his bloodline across every generation after him. The final act that ended the daemonic invasion demanded more than courage or skill alone. As the Elves' greatest mages prepared a working meant to drain the excess magic flooding the world and force the demonic hordes back from the material realm entirely, Aenarion took up arms to defend the ritual's casting, standing as its shield, while the spell did its terrible and necessary work. To wield the strength this defense required, he claimed the Sword of Khaine, a blade of such power that its use came bound to a curse few other weapons in the whole history of the Elves could claim to match. The working succeeded. Calidor and his fellow mages completed the great ritual that would come to be known as the Great Vortex, draining the world's excess magic and forcing the demonic tide back beyond the world's material bounds at last. Aenarion's defense had held long enough to see this ritual through to completion. A victory that saved not merely Ulthuan, but the whole of the world from a horror that had already come perilously close to unmaking everything the Old Ones and their successors had ever built. This working carried a significance reaching far beyond the immediate victory it purchased for the Elves of Ulthuan alone. The Great Vortex that Calidor and his fellow mages raised that day would remain, across every later age, one of the fundamental workings holding the whole world's magic in some measure of balance, a permanent fixture of Ulthuan's landscape and Ulthuan's purpose that would outlast every ruler and every kingdom that came after. Whatever else the Elves of this age achieved or lost in the centuries still to come, this single working would remain, a debt the whole world owed to the sacrifice Aenarion made possible. But the price of wielding the Sword of Khaine came due regardless of the victory it helped secure. Aenarion was mortally wounded in the course of this final defense, and though he lived long enough to return the cursed blade to its altar upon the Blighted Isle, the curse that came with wielding it did not end with his own death. It passed instead into his bloodline, a legacy of power and ruin both that would come to shape the fate of his own son far more terribly than Aenarion himself could ever have foreseen. A curse that outlives the very act that incurred it carries a particular tragedy, passed forward to descendants who never chose to wield the weapon that first brought it into being. Aenarion accepted the Sword of Khaine's terrible price with open eyes, understanding, as any warrior taking up so dangerous a weapon must, that some cost would, in time, be asked of him for its use. His son inherited that same cost, without ever having made the choice that incurred it, a burden passed down through blood, rather than through any decision the child himself was ever given the chance to make. One final thought is worth carrying forward from this whole origin before this story turns onward, a thought that will echo across every part still to come. A curse inherited rather than chosen carries a particular injustice that no amount of understanding can ever soften in whole. A child made to answer for a bargain struck long before his own birth, in circumstances he had no voice in shaping. Whatever Aenarion's son would come to do with the inheritance passed down to him, however dark his own choices would prove across the ages still to come, the curse itself was never his to refuse in the first place. A fact worth holding in mind, even as this story turns toward the darker path his own choices would, in time, carve. This inheritance would prove, across the long centuries that followed, to be among the most consequential burdens any figure in the whole history of Ulthuan was ever asked to carry. Whatever the precise nature of the curse Aenarion's bloodline now bore, it would shape the character and the fate of his son in ways the whole of Ulthuan would come to feel. A wound passed silently from father to child that neither of them had any true say in choosing. What that son would make of this inherited curse, and how his own rejection from the throne his father had built would come to shatter the very unity Aenarion had died to secure, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the sun passed over, and the quiet resentment that would, in time, tear all of Ulthuan apart. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the sun passed over, and the quiet resentment that would, in time, tear all of Ulthuan apart. Aenarion left behind a son who seemed, by every natural measure of birthright and battlefield renown, destined to inherit the throne his father had built through so much sacrifice. And yet, when the council of princes gathered to choose Ulthuan's next ruler, they turned instead to another. What followed from this single decision, made with the best of intentions by elves who believed they were protecting their people from further war, would set in motion a chain of resentment that no one in that council chamber could have imagined would end in the sundering of their whole race. Tonight we sit with the sun passed over, and the quiet resentment that would, in time, tear all of Ulthuan apart. Tonight we sit with the sun passed over, and the quiet resentment that would, in time, tear all of Ulthuan apart. Lapor, the son of Aenarion and Morathi. Malekith was born to Aenarion and the enchantress Morathi, a birthright that should, by every ordinary expectation, have marked him as the natural heir to his father's throne. Malekith came into the world as the son of Aenarion himself and Morathi, an elven enchantress whose own considerable gifts and considerable ambition would shape her son's life in ways neither of them could have anticipated in whole at his birth. By simple birthright, this parentage should have marked Malekith as the obvious and unquestioned heir to the throne his father had built through such costly sacrifice, a son of the very king who had united all of Ulthuan and driven back the demonic tide that had once threatened to end their whole civilization. Malekith grew into this expectation with every appearance of fitness for the role. He proved himself a warrior of exceptional skill and exceptional courage, a prince whose battlefield renown grew alongside his father's own legend, until it seemed only a matter of time before the throne Aenarion had built would pass naturally into his son's capable hands. Few among Ulthuan's princes, watching this young warrior come of age, would have guessed how thoroughly their own council would come to doubt his fitness for the crown his birth seemed to promise him. And yet, birthright and battlefield skill, however impressive, were never the only qualities the princes of Ulthuan would weigh in choosing their next ruler. Malekith carried, alongside his father's warrior spirit, a temperament that worried those who watched him closely, and a mother whose own reputation for ambition would prove, in the deliberations still to come, to weigh as heavily against him as any battlefield glory weighed in his favor. A young prince judged, even before he had done anything to earn, in whole, either praise or suspicion, by qualities he had inherited rather than chosen for himself, suffers a particular unfairness worth marking. Malekith did not select his own mother. did not choose the reputation her own considerable ambitions had already built long before his birth, nor did he choose the particular temperament, nature, and upbringing had given him, any more than any other elf chooses the raw material of their own character before circumstance and experience begin to shape it further. That these inherited qualities would come to weigh so heavily against him, regardless of his own conduct, marks the beginning of a pattern. This whole story will return to again and again. A prince judged as much for what he carried in his blood as for anything he had yet done with his own hands. Curry. The Council's fears. When the Council of Princes gathered to choose Aenarion's successor, they set Malekith aside in favour of Belshazzar of Tiranoc. Wary of a warlike temperament and a mother's influence, they judged too dangerous to place upon the throne. When the time came to choose who would guide Ulthuan through the peace that followed Aenarion's great victory, the Council of Princes turned their attention to Malekith as the obvious candidate his birthright suggested he should be. What they found, upon closer consideration, gave many among them genuine pause. Aenarion had led the Elves through a war so costly and so total that the whole of Ulthuan had grown wary of any ruler whose temperament might carry them into further conflict, and Malekith, for all his undeniable courage, struck many of the princes as too impetuous, too warlike, too much his father's son in just the respects that now gave them concern, rather than confidence. Alongside this worry about temperament ran a second and more delicate concern. The influence Morathi had already demonstrated she could wield, first over Aenarion himself, and now, the princes feared, over her own son in turn. Whatever gifts Morathi possessed, and they were considerable, her reputation for ambition and for subtle manipulation had not gone unnoticed across the whole of Ulthuan's ruling class. To crown Malekith, the princes reasoned, might well mean crowning Morathi's influence alongside him, a prospect that troubled even those princes who bore Malekith himself no particular ill will. Weighing these concerns against the alternative, the council turned instead to Belshazzar of Tiranoc, a prince whose steadier and less martial temperament seemed better suited to the work of rebuilding a civilization than to the work of leading it into further war. Whatever personal qualities recommended Belshazzar for the role, his selection was, at its heart, a choice made against Malekith, as much as it was a choice made for anyone else. A decision the princes believed would spare Ulthuan the risk of a second warrior king, in an age that desperately needed peace instead. The impossible marriage. Compounding the council's doubts, tradition demanded the Phoenix King take the Everqueen as his bride, and the new Everqueen, revealed alive after being believed lost, was Malekith's own half-sister. Beyond questions of temperament and maternal influence, a further obstacle stood in the way of Malekith's ascension, one that made his claim to the throne impossible, regardless of whatever else the council might have decided. Tradition held that the Phoenix King must take the Everqueen as his bride, a pairing that bound the two highest officers of Ulthuan together in marriage as well as in shared rule. Aenarion's children by his first wife, the Everqueen Astariel, had long been believed lost to the same catastrophe that had claimed so much else during the daemonic invasion. Their survival, when it came to light, upended whatever simple succession Malekith's birthright might otherwise have suggested. Ivrain, Aenarion's daughter, and thus Malekith's own half-sister, was revealed alive and, by the same ancient tradition that governed her people, inherited the mantle of Everqueen in her own right. This left the princes of Ulthuan facing an impossible arithmetic. For Malekith to become Phoenix King in the manner tradition demanded, he would need to take his own half-sister as his bride, a union the whole of Ulthuan's moral sensibility recoiled from entertaining even as a hypothetical. This obstacle alone, separate from every other doubt the princes already harboured about his temperament and his mother's influence, would have been sufficient to end any serious consideration of Malekith's claim to the throne, whatever grievance he might have nursed over questions of character or fitness to rule. This particular barrier offered him no ground for complaint that any reasonable observer could easily dispute, a circumstance of birth and tradition, rather than any judgment upon his own worthiness that even his staunchest supporters could find little room to argue against. There is something worth marking in how this particular obstacle differs from every other reason the princes offered for setting Malekith aside. Questions of temperament, however sincerely held, remain matters of judgment, open to disagreement, and to the possibility that circumstance might have proven the doubters wrong had events unfolded differently. The obstacle of Ivraine's survival and her claim to the Ever-Queen's mantle admitted no such ambiguity. No amount of Malekith's own conduct, however exemplary, could have resolved this particular barrier, for it rested not upon anyone's judgment of his character, but upon a simple and unalterable fact of blood. In this one respect at least, his exclusion from the throne carried a certainty the other, more contestable doubts about his fitness could never quite match. This distinction would matter greatly in the years still to come, for it meant Malekith could never entirely direct his resentment toward any single decision he might otherwise have hoped, in time, to see reversed. The council's doubts about his temperament might conceivably have softened had he continued to demonstrate the same gracious composure he now displayed. The obstacle of his own sister's claim to the Ever-Queen's throne offered no such possibility of future reconsideration. A permanent and unmovable wall standing between him and the crown, regardless of whatever else he might yet accomplish to prove himself worthy of it. A grace that concealed a wound. Malekith accepted the council's decision with outward composure, becoming the first to bow before Belshazzar and swear him fealty, even as resentment took root beneath this careful and convincing display of grace. Faced with the decision that denied him the throne his birthright seemed to promise, Malekith responded in a manner that impressed even those princes who had voted against him. He accepted the council's choice with what appeared to be genuine grace, offering no public complaint, no gathering of allies to contest the decision, no bitterness directed at Belshazzar himself. He was, in fact, the very first among all of Ulthuan's princes to bow before the new Phoenix King and swear him fealty, a gesture that spoke, to all outward appearances, of a prince who had made his peace with a decision he might have contested, and chosen instead to serve his people's chosen ruler with undivided loyalty. Even Morathi's own vocal fury at what she considered an injustice done to her son could not shake this outward composure. Where his mother railed against the council's decision, Malekith himself remained the model of gracious acceptance, a contrast that only deepened the impression of a prince whose character had proven itself worthy of respect even in disappointment. Whatever private cost this composure demanded of him, he never let it show in any public gesture the assembled princes of Ulthuan could point to as evidence of lingering grievance. Maintaining this composure across so public and so consequential a disappointment demanded a particular skill, one that suggests a discipline few princes of Ulthuan, whatever their other virtues, could easily have matched. To lose a throne one might reasonably have expected to inherit, and to do so while a mother's own fury made plain how keenly the injustice was felt within one's own family, and still to present nothing but grace and loyal service to the assembled court, demanded a mastery of one's own visible emotion that speaks either to genuine equanimity or to a talent for concealment that would, in time, prove far more consequential than any equanimity could ever have been. Whichever explanation holds the truer measure of Malekith's character in this moment, the effect upon those watching him was the same. He earned through this display a reputation for grace and loyalty that would follow him across the centuries still ahead, a reputation few among the watching princes thought to question, even as the quieter truth of his own feelings remained entirely hidden from their view. But grace offered outwardly is not the same as grievance resolved inwardly, and the years that followed would reveal, slowly, and at first almost imperceptibly, that Malekith's apparent acceptance had concealed a resentment that never really died, what this quiet, festering grievance would grow into across the centuries of exile and glory still ahead of him, and how a prince so widely admired for his gracious composure would come to be remembered instead as the architect of his people's greatest tragedy, is the story we turn to next. One final observation is worth carrying forward from this whole account of Malekith's rejection before this story turns onward, an observation that will echo through every part still to come. Nothing that happened in this council chamber was by itself unreasonable or unjust in the manner the princes intended it. They faced a genuine dilemma, weighed genuine concerns, and reached a decision most impartial observers, even now, would likely judge sound given what they knew at the time. And yet, this same reasonable decision, made by well-meaning princes acting in good faith, would prove to be the single spark from which the whole conflagration of the Sundering in time grew. A reminder that catastrophe need not begin with malice or folly, but can grow instead from choices that seemed, to everyone who made them, entirely sensible at the time. Tomorrow, we sit with glory in exile. The centuries Malekith spent building his own legend far from the throne that had been denied him. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with glory in exile. The centuries Malekith spent building his own legend far from the throne that had been denied him. Denied the throne his birthright had seemed to promise him, Malekith did not retreat into bitterness or idleness. He turned instead to the one arena still wholly open to him, the endless work of exploration and conquest beyond Ulthuan's own shores. And across the centuries that followed, he built a legend so formidable that few among the elves who sang his praises ever suspected the quiet resentment still burning beneath it. Tonight we sit with glory in exile. The centuries Malekith spent building his own legend far from the throne that had been denied him. Tonight we sit with glory in exile. The centuries Malekith spent building his own legend far from the throne that had been denied him. Ruler of Nagorith. Though denied the Phoenix throne, Malekith retained genuine and considerable power as leader of the elven military and prince of his father's own kingdom of Nagorith. Whatever disappointment Malekith carried from the council's decision, he did not emerge from it powerless or without genuine standing among his people. He became leader of the whole of the elven military, a position of real and considerable authority that placed the martial strength of all Ulthuan under his command, and he ruled as Prince of Nagorith, the very kingdom his father Aenarion had once called his own. This was no consolation prize offered merely to soothe a disappointed claimant. It was a position of genuine consequence, one that recognized Malekith's evident skill and his evident right to some meaningful share of the authority his birthright and his battlefield prowess had earned him. Nagarath itself carried a particular weight as the seat of this authority, a kingdom already bound to Aenarion's own legend, and now placed in the hands of his son. To rule the land his father had once called home was to inherit something of that legend by association, a connection that must have offered Malekith some measure of the recognition the Phoenix Throne itself had denied him, even as it could never replace in whole what that greater crown might have meant. This arrangement reflects something worth noting about how the Council of Princes had chosen to resolve the tension between Malekith's evident merit and their own doubts about his fitness for the highest office. Rather than exclude him from power entirely, an act that would surely have provoked far more immediate and open conflict than the quiet resentment that instead took root, they granted him genuine authority just short of the crown itself, a compromise that let Malekith's talents serve Ulthuan's interests while keeping the throne itself beyond his reach. A particular wisdom, or perhaps a particular naivety, runs through this compromise, one that the whole of this story's later unfolding would, in time, put to the harshest possible test. The Council seems to have reasoned that genuine authority, generously granted, might satisfy whatever ambition Malekith carried without ever requiring him to accept the throne he had been denied. This reasoning held, on its surface, for a considerable span of years, Malekith's evident satisfaction with his military command giving every outward appearance of a prince content with the authority he had been granted rather than the crown he had lost. Whether this satisfaction was ever more than appearance, or whether it concealed from the very beginning a grievance no amount of lesser authority could ever soothe in whole, is a question this whole story will spend its remaining chapters working to answer. The colonies beyond Ulthuan. With the daemonic invasion defeated and peace returned to Ulthuan, the Elves turned outward to explore and settle the wider world, and Malekith's military leadership carried him into the forefront of this great age of expansion. With the immediate threat of demonic invasion defeated and the whole of Ulthuan free, at last, to turn its attention outward once more, the Elves began a great age of exploration and colonization, establishing settlements across the seas and shores of the wider world, most of them raised in the lands of the Old World that lay to Ulthuan's east. This was an age of genuine achievement, elven ambition and elven skill, carrying their civilization's reach far beyond the island continent that had, until this point, contained the whole of their known history. Malekith, as leader of the elven military, found himself at the very forefront of this expansion, his forces committed to defending and extending these new colonies against whatever dangers the wider world presented. The lands beyond Ulthuan proved far less hospitable than the Elves' own ancient home, populated by orcs and goblins and beastmen, whose hostility toward these new elven settlements demanded constant vigilance and frequently open battle to answer. This period of expansion gave Malekith just the kind of stage his considerable martial talents were best suited to command, where the quieter work of governing an already peaceful Ulthuan might have offered him little opportunity to distinguish himself further. The harder and more dangerous work of defending new colonies against hostile and unfamiliar enemies let him demonstrate, again and again, the very qualities of courage and battlefield skill that had first marked him as Aenarion's natural heir. Every victory won in these distant lands added further luster to a reputation the Council's earlier decision had done nothing to diminish. Imagine, from Malekith's own vantage, the particular satisfaction of finding that the very qualities the Council had judged too dangerous for peacetime rule proved just the qualities this new age of expansion most urgently required. The impetuous, warlike temperament that had counted so heavily against him in the deliberations over succession became, on these distant and dangerous frontiers, an asset without which the colonies themselves might never have survived their earliest and most perilous years. Whether Malekith drew from this irony any bitter satisfaction, any quiet vindication of the very traits his own people had once judged unsuitable for the crown, the surviving record does not say, though it would be a strange prince indeed, who felt nothing at all in seeing his once doubted nature proven so thoroughly necessary. The rescue of Athel Turalyon. Among Malekith's many exploits during this age of colonization, none earned him greater and more lasting gratitude than his rescue of the colonists of Athel Turalyon from a besieging orc horde. Among the many battles Malekith fought in defense of Ulthuan's growing colonies, none would prove more consequential to his own legend than his rescue of Athel Turalyon, a settlement whose colonists found themselves besieged by an orc horde that threatened to overwhelm their defenses entirely. Malekith's intervention broke this siege and saved the settlement from a fate that had already claimed lesser colonies elsewhere across the perilous lands beyond Ulthuan, earning him the undying gratitude of everyone whose lives his timely arrival had preserved. This single act of rescue carried weight far beyond the immediate military value of one saved colony. It offered concrete and undeniable proof of precisely the kind of leadership and courage that made Malekith so formidable a commander. A demonstration that no amount of court intrigue or careful political maneuvering could ever quite match for its clarity. Those whose lives he had personally saved owed him a debt no council decision could erase, a debt that spread, through their own testimony, into a wider reputation for genuine heroism that followed Malekith across every subsequent age of his long exile. A particular irony runs through how thoroughly deserved this reputation was, even as the ambitions still burning beneath Malekith's gracious composure remained hidden from those who now sang his praises. The gratitude of Athel Turalyon's saved colonists was no political fiction manufactured to serve some hidden purpose. It was earned plainly through genuine courage and genuine skill by a prince whose private grievances never once compromised the quality of the service he continued to offer his people across these long centuries of exile. This coexistence of genuine virtue and hidden resentment deserves to be held with care rather than resolved too quickly into any simple judgment of Malekith's character. He was not, in these years of exile, a villain wearing the mask of a hero, performing heroic deeds purely to disguise darker purposes he had already formed in whole. The evidence suggests something more complicated and, in its way, more troubling. A prince whose heroism was entirely real, whose service to his people cost him genuine risk and genuine sacrifice, and who nonetheless carried within himself a grievance that all this genuine virtue never quite managed to extinguish. Whatever Malekith would later become, the elf who saved Athel Turalyon was not merely performing goodness. He was, in that moment and in countless moments like it, good in the truest sense, a fact that makes what follows in this story only more difficult to reconcile. First contact with the dwarves. Malekith's explorations carried him into contact with the dwarves of the Eastern Mountains, a meeting between two great peoples that would, for a time, blossom into a friendship neither race had known before. Among the many distinctions Malekith earned during his centuries of exile, none would prove more historically significant than his role as the first elf to make contact with the dwarves, an ancient people whose own civilization had developed in isolation from Ulthuan across ages neither race had thought to bridge before. This meeting opened a relationship between elves and dwarves that would, for a considerable span of years, flourish into genuine trade and genuine friendship. Two proud and ancient peoples finding in each other allies whose skills complemented what their own civilization lacked. This friendship carried real substance rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. Trade flourished between the two peoples, dwarfish craft finding eager markets among the elves, even as elven goods travelled the other direction into the mountain holds the dwarves called home. For a time, this exchange offered both peoples something of real value, a partnership built on mutual respect between civilizations ancient enough to recognize worth in one another, despite their considerable differences of custom and temperament. There is something worth marking in what this friendship reveals about the wider Malekith. The ages of exile had shaped by this point in his life a prince capable of genuine diplomacy and genuine partnership, even beyond the narrower circle of his own people. To forge a lasting bond with a race as proud and as different in temperament as the dwarfs demanded qualities beyond mere martial skill, a patience and a respect for difference that speaks to a more rounded character than his battlefield reputation alone might otherwise suggest. Whatever grievance still burned beneath his composed exterior, it had not, at this stage of his long exile, curdled into the kind of contempt for others that might have made such a delicate and hard-won friendship impossible to build. That Malekith himself stood at the very centre of this historic friendship only added further to a reputation already considerable from his rescue of Athel Turalian and his countless other victories across the colonies. He had become, by this stage of his long exile, one of the most celebrated figures in the whole of elven civilization, a prince whose achievements in the wider world seemed to answer, however incompletely, whatever disappointment the Council's earlier decision might once have caused him. One final thought is worth carrying forward from this whole long age of glory before this story turns toward its darker unravelling. Every achievement this part has followed, the command of Nagarith, the defence of the colonies, the rescue of Athel Turalian, the friendship with the dwarfs, was real, was earned, and was, by any reasonable measure, more than sufficient to satisfy the ambitions of almost any prince who might have found himself in Malekith's position. That none of it, in the end, proved sufficient to satisfy Malekith himself says less about the scale of what he achieved than about the particular and specific nature of what he had lost. A throne no accumulation of lesser glories could ever quite replace. What none of these admirers could see was the quiet resentment that had never really faded beneath this gracious and accomplished exterior. A bitterness that would, upon Malekith's eventual return to Ulthuan, find fertile ground already waiting to receive it. What Malekith found waiting for him when he returned home at last, and the corruption already spreading through the land he had left behind, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the cult of pleasure. The dark sect Malekith discovered had taken root in Ulthuan during his long years away. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the cult of pleasure. The dark sect Malekith discovered had taken root in Ulthuan during his long years away. After centuries spent building his legend across the colonies of the wider world, Malekith returned at last to the homeland he had left behind, expecting to find the same peaceful and prosperous Ulthuan his long exile had carried him away from. What he found instead was a civilization already sliding toward corruption, a dark cult spreading quietly through the highest circles of elven society, and a homeland closer to the brink of ruin than any of his distant victories could have prepared him to discover. Tonight we sit with the cult of pleasure. the dark sect Malekith discovered had taken root in Ulthuan during his long years away. Tonight we sit with the cult of pleasure. The dark sect Malekith discovered had taken root in Ulthuan during his long years away. Return to a changed homeland. When Malekith returned to Ulthuan at last after his centuries of glory abroad, he found a homeland transformed, its peace and prosperity concealing a corruption that had already spread further than anyone still loyal to the old order seemed willing to admit. After so long an absence, spent building a legend across the colonies and the wider world beyond Ulthuan's own shores, Malekith returned home to a homeland he no longer entirely recognized. The peace and prosperity he remembered from his youth remained, on the surface, largely intact. Ulthuan's great city still standing, its ancient traditions still observed in every outward form his memory could confirm. But beneath this familiar surface, something had shifted during his long years away, a change subtle enough that those who had lived through its slow arrival seemed scarcely to notice how far it had already progressed. This is often the way corruption spreads with the greatest success, through a patient accumulation of small compromises, rather than through sudden and visible catastrophe, each one unremarkable enough on its own to escape serious challenge, until the accumulated weight of all of them together has already reshaped a whole civilization, before anyone still loyal to the older order thinks to sound an alarm. Malekith, returning after so long an absence, possessed a clarity of perspective those who had lived through the slow change could no longer easily claim, a stranger's eye for a transformation that had become, to those who witnessed it unfold day by day, only the new and unremarkable shape of ordinary life. A long absence provides a particular kind of value this whole account of Malekith's return illustrates plainly. Those who remain within a slowly changing society lose, almost without noticing the loss, their capacity to see that society as it once was, each day's small adjustment folding seamlessly into the day before it, until the whole accumulated distance travelled becomes invisible to eyes that never looked away long enough to measure it. Malekith's centuries abroad, whatever else they cost him in terms of lost time with the homeland he still loved, granted him precisely the vantage point needed to see Ulthuan's slow transformation as transformation at all, rather than as the unremarkable and unquestioned texture of ordinary life it had become to everyone who had never left. What Malekith found, once he began to look closely at the homeland his long exile had kept from him, was a civilization whose long centuries of peace and prosperity had bred within it a hunger for ever more intense sensation, a restlessness that ordinary pleasures could no longer satisfy. This restlessness, left unchecked and unaddressed by a society too comfortable to examine its own quiet decay, had already begun to find outlet in practices far darker than the Elves of Aenarion's own generation would ever have countenanced. The Scytterai and the cult of pleasure. A secret cult devoted to the Scytterai, the darker gods of the elven pantheon, had taken root across Ulthuan's highest circles, offering ever more extreme sensation to a people whose long peace had left them hungry for something ordinary pleasure could no longer provide. At the heart of the corruption, Malekith discovered lay a secret and spreading devotion to the Scytterai, the darker and more dangerous gods of the elven pantheon, powers whose worship promised sensation and satisfaction far beyond anything the elves' more conventional faith could offer. This devotion took shape as the cult of pleasure, a movement that spread quietly through Ulthuan's highest social circles, offering initiates access to pleasures and sensations that grew, with each new indulgence, ever more extreme, ever more dangerous, ever further removed from anything the elves' own traditions would ordinarily have permitted. The appeal of this cult becomes easier to understand set against the particular condition of Ulthuan's ruling class by this stage of their long and largely unbroken peace. Generations removed from the desperate struggle that had once nearly destroyed their whole civilization, the elves of Malekith's homeland had grown so accustomed to comfort and safety that ordinary pleasures no longer offered the satisfaction they once had. Into this restlessness, the cult of pleasure offered something new, sensation without limit, indulgence without the older constraints that had once bound elven society together, a promise that proved seductive precisely because it answered a hunger the elves' own comfortable prosperity had created within them. This is a particular danger worth marking in any civilization that achieves lasting peace and lasting comfort, one this whole story will return to before its telling is complete. A people who no longer face genuine existential threat may find themselves, in time, manufacturing threats of a different and more insidious kind from within their own restless hunger for sensation, a corruption born not from external enemy or invading horror, but from the very success and safety their earlier struggles had purchased for them. A particular irony runs through this pattern, one that touches on the deepest theme this whole story has followed from its very first telling. Aenarion had fought and died to save Ulthuan from a horror that threatened to unmake it entirely from without. His own grandchildren's generation now found itself threatened by a horror that grew instead from within, born not of any external enemy but of the very peace and prosperity his sacrifice had purchased for them. The demonic tide Aenarion drove back had been an enemy any elf could recognize and resist with a clear conscience. The corruption now spreading through Ulthuan's highest circles offered no such easy clarity, dressed as it was in the familiar comforts of continued peace, rather than in any obvious guise of invading horror. This distinction matters greatly for understanding why the corruption spread as far as it did before anyone thought to challenge it seriously. An external enemy announces itself through violence and destruction that even the most complacent society cannot long ignore. A corruption that offers pleasure and comfort, however dangerous its ultimate trajectory, provokes no such immediate alarm, allowing it to take root and spread through generations of willing participants who saw, in their own indulgence, nothing more sinister than the ordinary pursuit of happiness their long peace had, they believed, fairly earned them. Notice, too, who found themselves drawn toward this dark and spreading devotion. For the cult's success owed itself in no small part to precisely those elves best positioned to conceal its practice from wider scrutiny. It was Ulthuan's highest circles, the princes and nobles and courtiers whose standing gave them both the leisure to pursue such dangerous sensation and the influence to shield their own indulgence from public accountability, who proved most susceptible to the Scytherai's promises. The very elves entrusted with preserving Ulthuan's traditions and Ulthuan's welfare had become, in growing numbers, the most active participants in a corruption that threatened both, a rot spreading from precisely the positions of trust and authority least likely to be questioned by those beneath them. Morathi's secret hand. Beneath the surface of this spreading cult, Malekith discovered a truth that must have struck him with particular force. His own mother, Morathi, stood as the secret architect and leader of the very corruption now threatening to consume their homeland. As Malekith investigated the corruption he found spreading through Ulthuan's higher circles, he uncovered a truth that must have carried a particular and devastating weight for him personally. The secret architect behind the whole spreading cult of pleasure was his own mother, Morathi, the very figure whose ambition and whose influence had already once cost him his claim to the Phoenix throne, now stood revealed as the hidden hand guiding a corruption that threatened to consume the whole of Ulthuan from within. This discovery must have landed with a weight few other revelations in the whole of Malekith's long life could match. Morathi was not merely a mother, whose reputation had complicated his own political fortunes years before. She was, it now became clear, an active and ongoing architect of the very decay he had returned home to confront. A woman whose ambitions had grown across his long absence from the kind of court influence the council once feared into something far more dangerous and far more corrosive to the whole civilization her son had once hoped to rule. A pattern worth marking runs through how Morathi's ambition had evolved across the years of Malekith's absence, revealing something important about the nature of unchecked influence left to grow unopposed. Where once her ambition had expressed itself through more ordinary channels of court intrigue and maternal advocacy on her son's behalf, the years without any check upon her influence appear to have carried that same ambition towards something considerably darker, a hunger for power that found, in the Scytherized dark promises, a means of control far more absolute than any court position could ever have offered her. Whatever restraint Aenarion's own presence, or later Malekith's own watchful proximity, might once have placed upon her ambitions, their absence across these long years had let that ambition grow unchecked into something neither of them, perhaps, would have recognized in her earlier and more ordinary displays of maternal advocacy. This raises a difficult question that this story leaves largely for its listener to weigh. Whether Morathi's transformation into the secret architect of Ulthuan's corruption was inevitable given her character from the very beginning, or whether it was, in some measure, a product of circumstance, an ambition that might have found gentler expression had it never been given so many years of unwatched freedom to grow according to its own darkest inclinations. Imagine the particular anguish of discovering that the corruption threatening one's whole homeland traces back to one's own family, a betrayal more intimate and more difficult to answer than any external enemy could ever inflict. Whatever action Malekith might have taken against a foreign cult or a foreign corrupting influence, the same response against his own mother demanded something far more painful. A reckoning not merely with a political rival or a dangerous ideology, but with the very woman who had raised him, whose ambition on his own behalf had once cost him a throne, now revealed as the architect of a corruption that threatened everything he still hoped to preserve. A hard question sits with imagining what Malekith must have weighed in these first hours of discovery, a choice that would shape everything still to come in this story. A son confronting a mother's guilt carries options no stranger confronting the same crime would ever need to consider. Silence bought through familial loyalty, private confrontation kept from wider notice, or public reckoning that risks exposing his own family's shame to the whole of Ulthuan's judgment. Whatever calculation Malekith made in choosing his eventual course, it would prove, in the ages still to come, to carry consequences far beyond anything a simpler and more distant enemy's corruption could ever have demanded of him. What Malekith chose to do with this terrible discovery, and the drastic measures he would take under the guise of rooting out this same corruption, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the Inquisition and the fall of the princes, the violence Malekith unleashed in the name of purging Ulthuan of the very darkness his own mother had helped to plant. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the Inquisition and the fall of the princes, the violence Malekith unleashed in the name of purging Ulthuan of the very darkness his own mother had helped to plant. Having discovered the corruption spreading through Ulthuan's highest circles, and the terrible truth of his own mother's hand in planting it, Malekith launched an Inquisition meant to root out the cult of pleasure and its followers. What began as an investigation into genuine corruption would, before it ran its course, consume nearly the whole of Ulthuan's ruling class, leaving behind a bloodshed few in that council chamber could have imagined when Malekith first proposed his solution. Tonight we sit with the Inquisition and the fall of the princes, the violence Malekith unleashed in the name of purging Ulthuan of the very darkness his own mother had helped to plant. Tonight we sit with the Inquisition and the fall of the princes, the violence Malekith unleashed in the name of purging Ulthuan of the very darkness his own mother had helped to plant. Chalkichi. The Inquisition begins. Malekith launched an Inquisition against the cult of pleasure, ostensibly to root out its corruption from Ulthuan's highest circles, though the investigation soon began to serve purposes reaching well beyond its stated aim. Armed with the terrible knowledge of how far the cult of pleasure's corruption had already spread, Malekith moved to answer it with an Inquisition, an investigation meant to identify and remove the cult's followers from positions of trust and influence across Ulthuan. On its face, this was precisely the response the crisis demanded, a determined effort to root out a genuine and spreading corruption before it could consume any further portion of the civilization his own father had once died to preserve. But an Inquisition granted such sweeping authority to investigate and to judge carries within it a danger that reaches well beyond whatever corruption it was first raised to answer. The very power needed to root out a hidden cult, the authority to accuse, to interrogate, to condemn without the ordinary constraints that might otherwise check such investigations, offers itself just as readily to purposes far removed from rooting out genuine corruption. Whatever Malekith's original intentions, the Inquisition he now commanded gave him a tool capable of far more than its stated purpose alone required. This pattern has repeated itself across countless ages and countless civilizations beyond this single story of Ulthuan's decline. Authority granted for one purpose rarely confines itself neatly to that purpose alone, especially when the crisis justifying its creation runs deep enough to silence the ordinary caution that might otherwise question how far such authority should reach. Those who granted Malekith this sweeping power did so in good faith, trusting that a genuine crisis demanded a response of equal weight. What they could not easily anticipate was how readily that same power, once granted, might be turned toward purposes the crisis itself had never required. This is not to suggest that every Inquisition must always corrupt itself toward such misuse, only that the particular combination of genuine crisis and sweeping authority creates conditions in which misuse becomes far easier to accomplish and far harder to detect before considerable damage has already been done. Ulthuan's princes, faced with unmistakable evidence of the cult of pleasure's corruption, had little practical alternative to granting Malekith the authority he requested. That this same authority would, in time, be turned against many of them personally was a consequence few among them could have reasonably foreseen when they first agreed to its necessity. One final thought is worth marking before this account turns toward the violence that followed, reaching into the whole tragedy of how good intentions and genuine necessity can still lead toward catastrophe when combined with a figure whose private grievances no one around him had thought to weigh with sufficient care. Every prince who agreed to grant Malekith this authority did so believing they served Ulthuan's genuine interest, answering a real threat with a real and proportionate response. that their good faith would be turned before this crisis reached its conclusion. Against so many of their own number stands as one of the harder lessons this whole story has to offer. That necessity and virtue, however sincerely held, offer no guarantee against the darker purposes such necessity might yet be made to serve. A particular danger runs through any crisis that grants extraordinary authority to a single figure already carrying private grievances few around him suspected in whole. Malekith came to this Inquisition as a son, whose own claim to the throne had been denied years before, as much as a prince determined to save his homeland from corruption, whose resentment had never faded in whole, despite every outward appearance of gracious acceptance. Whether he set out from the very beginning to use this crisis for purposes beyond its stated aim, or whether the temptation grew slowly, over time, as the investigation's sweeping authority revealed what else it might accomplish, the surviving record does not say with certainty. The death of Bel-Shannar. Amid the growing turmoil of the Inquisition, Phoenix King Bel-Shannar died under circumstances that remain disputed to this day, his supporters and his accusers offering entirely different accounts of what befell him. As the Inquisition's reach extended further into Ulthuan's highest circles, Phoenix King Bel-Shannar himself died, an event whose true circumstances the surviving accounts of this period have never managed to settle with any certainty. Those inclined to view Malekith's actions favorably held that Bel-Shannar took his own life, driven to this final act by the horror of interrogation that might otherwise have revealed his own entanglement with the very corruption the Inquisition was meant to expose. Those loyal to the wider council, growing more and more suspicious of how conveniently this Inquisition seemed to serve Malekith's own ambitions, accused him face to face of orchestrating the Phoenix King's death himself. This dispute over Bel-Shannar's death cannot be resolved by anything this story has access to confirm with certainty, and it deserves to be presented honestly as the contested matter it remains even now. What can be said is that his death, whatever its true cause, removed the very figure whose selection over Malekith years before had first set this whole long chain of resentment into motion, a convenient outcome for Malekith's ambitions regardless of whether his own hand played any direct role in bringing it about. A particular difficulty runs through any attempt to weigh this dispute fairly, bound up in the whole challenge of understanding events so heavily contested by those who lived through them. Every account of Bel-Shannar's death comes filtered through the loyalties of whoever preserved it, Malekith's supporters shaping their telling to exonerate a leader they still followed, his accusers shaping theirs to condemn a rival they had already come to fear. Neither account can claim the kind of disinterested clarity that might otherwise let a later listener judge the truth with confidence, and this story has chosen to present both readings honestly, rather than pretend to a certainty the surviving evidence cannot support at all. Whatever the truth of this disputed death, it is worth noting that the very fact of the dispute itself tells us something important about how thoroughly Ulthuan's ruling class had already fractured by this point in the unfolding crisis. A death that might, in calmer times, have been mourned and investigated with some shared confidence in the process, instead became yet another battleground upon which Malekith's supporters and his growing number of critics fought to shape the narrative each side would carry forward into whatever confrontations still lay ahead. Whatever the truth of this disputed death, its consequences proved immediate and severe. With the Phoenix King gone, and the Inquisition's authority still expanding, the question of succession that had once been settled through careful deliberation now stood open once more. Precisely the circumstance Malekith's own long-nursed ambitions had waited years to see arise again. the fall of the princes. What followed Belshazzar's death was a violent confrontation between Malekith and the Council of Princes, a bloodshed that claimed most of Ulthuan's ruling class and left Malekith standing as the last significant authority remaining. The dispute that followed Belshazzar's death, ostensibly over how best to continue the Inquisition and address the corruption it had uncovered, turned from argument into open violence with a swiftness that suggests how thoroughly the trust between Malekith and the wider council had already eroded. What began as a disagreement over policy became, before it ran its course, a massacre that claimed the lives of most of Ulthuan's ruling princes, killed by Malekith and those followers who had rallied to his cause across the whole course of the Inquisition's expanding authority. Malekith's own justification for this violence framed it as a bitter but necessary measure, the elimination of a council whose ranks had, in his account, grown too compromised by the very corruption the Inquisition existed to root out to be trusted with continued authority over Ulthuan's fate. Whether this justification reflected genuine conviction or served merely as convenient cover for a resentment given, at last, the opportunity to act, the practical effect was the same regardless. The body that had once denied Malekith the throne now lay broken, its authority to make any further such decisions permanently ended. Notice how thoroughly this justification, whatever its underlying sincerity, mirrored the very language the Inquisition itself had already normalized across the whole course of its investigation. Having spent this stretch of Ulthuan's history teaching its people to view corruption as a hidden and pervasive threat lurking behind even the most trusted and respected faces, Malekith now applied that same logic to the council itself, a rhetorical move that required no new justification beyond what the Inquisition's own premise had already established as reasonable suspicion. The very framework built to expose the cult of pleasure's hidden followers proved equally capable of framing an entire council of princes as similarly compromised, whether or not the charge held any more substance in their case than it had in countless others the Inquisition had already condemned. This is perhaps the truest danger any such Inquisition carries within itself. Not merely that it might be misused by whoever commands it, but that its own internal logic, once accepted by a frightened populace desperate for answers, provides ready justification for whatever further targets its commander chooses to name. A bitter symmetry runs through this outcome, one the princes who first passed Malekith over years before could scarcely have imagined when they made their careful and well-intentioned decision. They had set him aside specifically out of concern for his impetuous and warlike temperament, judging him too dangerous a figure to trust with the crown during a fragile peace. That same warlike temperament, given years to fester beneath a gracious exterior and granted, at last, the pretext of a genuine crisis to act upon, would prove to be just the danger they had once feared, visited now upon the very body whose caution had first tried to guard against it. One final and uncomfortable thought is worth carrying forward from this whole bloody episode, touching on the deepest irony of the Council's original decision so many years before. Had they crowned Malekith Phoenix King when his birthright first suggested they should, he would have inherited the throne through the ordinary and sanctioned channels of succession, his temperament tempered from the outset by the responsibilities and the accountability that legitimate rule demands. By setting him aside instead, hoping to spare Ulthuan the risk his warlike nature seemed to threaten, the princes may have inadvertently ensured that when his ambition did, at last, find its outlet, it arrived through the very massacre this part of the story has now followed to its bloody conclusion, rather than through legitimate succession. What became possible Once this violence had cleared the last significant obstacle standing between Malekith and the throne, and the terrible test that still awaited him before he could claim it, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the sacred fire's judgment, the flame of Aenarion that would decide once and for all whether Malekith was fit to rule. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the sacred fire's judgment, the flame of Aenarion that would decide once and for all whether Malekith was fit to rule. With the Council of Princes destroyed and no further political obstacles standing between himself and the crown his birthright had once promised him, Malekith approached the final test every Phoenix King before him had needed to pass. The sacred fire of Aenarion, the divine flame that would confirm or deny his fitness to rule. He walked toward this flame with total confidence, certain that the same fire that had blessed his father would bless him in turn. What awaited him instead would prove to be the single most devastating judgment of his entire existence. Tonight we sit with the sacred fire's judgment, the flame of Aenarion that would decide once and for all whether Malekith was fit to rule. Tonight we sit with the sacred fire's judgment, the flame of Aenarion that would decide once and for all whether Malekith was fit to rule. Confidence before the flame. With every political obstacle removed at last, Malekith approached the sacred fire of Aenarion with total confidence, certain that the same divine flame which had blessed his father would recognize and bless him in turn. With the council destroyed and no living authority remaining to contest his claim, Malekith turned at last to the one test that had always stood beyond the reach of political maneuvering or violent elimination. The sacred fire of Aenarion, the divine flame every Phoenix King before him had been required to walk through unharmed as proof of the god's own favor resting upon their rule. This was no ceremonial formality, but a genuine test of divine judgment. A fire that would, according to the oldest traditions of Ulthuan, burn and consume any claimant the gods themselves judged unworthy of the crown. Malekith approached this test with a confidence that history would soon reveal to be entirely misplaced. His father Aenarion had walked through this same flame and emerged blessed, confirmed by the gods themselves as Ulthuan's rightful defender and first Phoenix King. Malekith, carrying his father's blood and his father's evident martial glory, saw no reason to doubt that the same flame would recognize in him the same divine favor, a certainty that had carried him through every political calculation leading up to this moment. A particular psychology worth examining runs through this confidence, revealing something important about how Malekith had come to understand his own claim to the throne across all the years of rejection and exile that preceded this moment. He had, by this point, convinced himself so thoroughly of his own rightful claim that the prospect of divine rejection seems never to have entered seriously into his calculations. Every setback he had faced until now, the Council's original decision, the years of exile, had come from mortal judgment, fallible and correctable through sufficiently determined action. The sacred fire represented, in his own understanding, not a further obstacle to overcome, but a final and certain vindication, the moment when the gods themselves would confirm what mortal politics had so unjustly denied him. This certainty blinded him, it seems, to a possibility that ought to have given him at least some pause, that the very corruption he had returned home to fight, and the violence he had employed in fighting it, might itself have marked him in ways no mortal council could perceive, but that a divine flame testing something deeper than mere birthright or battlefield glory could recognize at once and in whole. A further irony is worth naming here. How thoroughly Malekith's own actions, taken in the name of purging Ulthuan's corruption, may have contributed to the very verdict he never saw coming. Whatever his intentions in launching the Inquisition and the violence that followed it, the methods he chose, the murders committed under cover of righteous purpose, the ambiguous circumstances surrounding Belshazzar's death, carried their own weight regardless of whatever justification Malekith offered for them. A flame testing the fitness of a soul to rule might reasonably weigh such methods as heavily as it weighed any birthright or any battlefield glory, a possibility Malekith's own confidence had never once permitted him to seriously entertain. A particular irony runs through this confidence, one the whole of this story's unfolding would soon expose with terrible clarity. Malekith had spent years calculating and manipulating his way past every human obstacle standing between himself and the throne, eliminating rivals, orchestrating an inquisition that served purposes far beyond its stated aim, accepting or perhaps arranging the death of a Phoenix King who stood in his way. Whatever these actions revealed about his own character, he seems never to have considered that the same judgment he had so thoroughly evaded from mortal authorities might yet await him from a source no amount of political calculation could ever hope to manipulate. The flame's rejection. Where Aenarion had once walked through the sacred fire and emerged blessed, Malekith stepped into the same flame and was instead burned and maimed, a judgment from Aenarion himself that confirmed, in the most public and devastating manner possible, that the god considered him unfit to rule. The moment Malekith stepped into the sacred fire of Aenarion, whatever confidence had carried him to this point met a judgment no political maneuvering could soften or deny. Rather than embrace him as it had once embraced his father, the flame burned him savagely, maiming him in a manner that left no room for any interpretation other than the plainest one available. Aenarion himself had judged Malekith unworthy of the crown, a rejection delivered not through the fallible judgment of mortal princes, but through the direct and undeniable verdict of a god. This rejection carried a devastation that no political defeat, however severe, could ever have matched. To be denied the throne by a council of princes, however painful, at least left room for grievance, for the possibility that mortal judgment had erred where a fairer assessment might have recognized his worth. The sacred fire offered no such comfort. Its verdict came from a source Malekith's own theology held to be beyond appeal, a confirmation that whatever ambition had driven him to this moment, the very gods he and his people worshipped had already judged that ambition unworthy of fulfillment. A particular cruelty runs through how thoroughly public this rejection proved, a humiliation witnessed rather than suffered in private. Whatever secret hopes Malekith had carried into the flame, whatever certainty had sustained him through years of careful political maneuvering, all of it burned away before witnesses whose presence ensured that no version of events favourable to his own reputation could ever erase in whole what had really occurred. A private failure might have been reshaped through careful telling, softened or explained away to those who had not witnessed it face to face. A rejection, this public admitted no such reshaping, its plain and undeniable fact known to everyone who had gathered to watch what should have been his coronation. This publicity mattered a great deal for what followed, for it meant Malekith could never merely resume his political ambitions as though this rejection had not occurred. Every claim he might make to the throne from this point forward would carry the shadow of a divine verdict witnessed by all of Ulthuan, a burden his careful political calculations had never accounted for and could never overcome in whole through strategy alone. Imagine what this public rejection meant for how the wider people of Ulthuan now understood their own recent history, the Inquisition and the massacre of the princes that Malekith had justified as necessary purification. If the sacred fire itself now confirmed him unfit to rule, what did that verdict suggest about the violence he had already committed in pursuit of a throne the gods themselves had judged him unworthy to claim? This question, whether openly voiced or only quietly wondered, would surely have complicated whatever loyalty Malekith's supporters still carried toward him, a doubt planted by divine judgment that no amount of subsequent conquest could ever entirely silence. Whatever secret corruption or hidden unworthiness the Flame's judgment was responding to, and the surviving accounts offer only speculation on this point, the public and undeniable nature of this rejection marked a turning point from which Malekith's whole subsequent path would follow. He had eliminated every mortal obstacle standing between himself and the crown, only to discover that the crown itself remained governed by a judgment no elimination could reach or silence. Morathi's desperate remedy. Grievously wounded by the Flame's rejection, Malekith was nursed back from the edge of death by his mother Morathi, who sealed his ruined body within an enchanted suit of black armor that would sustain him for every age still to come. In the aftermath of this devastating rejection, Malekith lay grievously wounded, his body burned and maimed by the very fire he had approached with such total confidence only moments before. It was Morathi who took up the desperate work of saving her son's life, employing every measure of her own considerable and dangerous power to keep him from dying of wounds that would, by any ordinary measure, have already claimed him. Her efforts succeeded, though the son she saved would never again be the same figure who had walked so confidently into the sacred fire. To sustain Malekith's ruined body, Morathi crafted a suit of enchanted black armor, a creation of her own considerable and ever-darkening power that would come to bind itself to her son for every age of his existence still to come. This armor was no mere protective covering, but a genuine, life-sustaining necessity, holding together a body the sacred fire had damaged beyond what ordinary healing could ever hope to restore. Malekith would wear this black armor in one form or another for the whole of his remaining existence, a permanent and visible reminder of the judgment that had once burned him and the mother, whose dark power alone had kept him from dying of it. A particular dependency runs through what this armor represents, one that reshaped the whole balance of power between mother and son in ways neither of them could escape in whole from this point forward. Whatever resentment Malekith might have carried toward Morathi's earlier interference in his political fortunes, he now owed her the very continuation of his physical existence, a debt no amount of pride or independence could ever discharge in whole. Morathi, who had once schemed to see her son upon the throne, now held him bound to her through a dependency more intimate and more permanent than any political scheme had ever achieved, her power holding together, in the most literal sense, the body he needed merely to continue existing at all. This dynamic would prove consequential for everything still to come in this story. A mother and son, bound together not merely by blood and shared ambition, but by a literal physical dependency that neither could easily set aside regardless of whatever disagreements or divergent purposes might otherwise have separated them. A bitter symmetry closes a circle first opened in this story's very beginning. Aenarion had taken up the cursed Sword of Khaine and paid for its power with his own eventual death, a curse passed down into his bloodline that neither he nor his son ever chose to bear. Now that same bloodline's curse found fresh and terrible expression in Malekith's own ruin, a son burned by the very divine fire his father had once walked through blessed, saved only by a mother whose own power had already once cost him his claim to the throne, and would now, in saving his life, bind him to her more than ever before. One final thought is worth carrying forward from this whole devastating episode, reaching toward the deepest tragedy this story has followed since its very first telling. Malekith had spent years believing that the throne denied him was an injustice correctable through sufficient patience, sufficient service, or, when those proved insufficient, sufficient force. The sacred fire's judgment suggested something far harder to accept, that perhaps no amount of correction, however determined, could answer whatever the flame had seen in him, a possibility that left him only one path still open, a path that would abandon every pretense of legitimate claim in favor of naked and unashamed conquest. What Malekith made of this devastating rejection, and the war he would soon unleash upon the very homeland that had denied him twice over, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the civil war, the open conflict Malekith launched to claim by force the throne every judgment, mortal and divine alike, had denied him. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the civil war, the open conflict Malekith launched to claim by force the throne every judgment, mortal and divine alike, had denied him. Rejected by the sacred fire and saved from death only by his mother's dark power, Malekith faced a choice that would determine the whole future of his people. He could accept the judgment that had already condemned him twice over, first by mortal council, and now by the gods themselves, or he could claim by naked force what every legitimate path had denied him. He chose war. Tonight we sit with the civil war, the open conflict Malekith launched to claim by force the throne every judgment, mortal and divine alike, had denied him. Tonight we sit with the civil war, the open conflict Malekith launched to claim by force the throne every judgment, mortal and divine alike, had denied him. Malekith raises his banner. Abandoning every claim to legitimate succession, Malekith raised open war against his own homeland, seeking through naked conquest what the Council and the Sacred Fire alike had already denied him. With every legitimate path to the throne now closed to him, twice rejected by mortal council and by divine judgment both, Malekith made the choice that would define the whole remainder of his existence and shatter the whole of his people's future along with it. He raised open war against Ulthuan itself, abandoning any pretense that his claim to the crown rested upon rightful succession or divine favor, and seeking instead to claim by force what every other path had already denied him. This was no small or hesitant escalation. Malekith commanded, by this point in his long and storied career, genuine and considerable military strength, forces loyal to him from his command of the Elven military and his long rule over Nagarath, warriors who had followed him through the colonies and through countless earlier victories, and who now turned that same loyalty towards civil war against their own kin. Whatever hesitation such warriors might have carried about turning their blades against fellow elves, Malekith's own reputation and his own considerable charisma proved sufficient to carry many of them into a war few among them could have imagined joining only years before. What it took to carry so many loyal warriors into a war against their own people speaks to the whole depth of trust Malekith had built across his centuries of genuine service. Soldiers do not lightly turn their weapons against their own kin, however commanding a leader's reputation might be. That so many of Nagaritha's warriors followed Malekith into this civil war suggests a loyalty built on genuine respect earned across real campaigns rather than mere political maneuvering. A loyalty that makes the whole tragedy of this war deeper still, for it meant Malekith's own considerable virtues, the very qualities that had earned him such devoted service, were now turned toward a purpose that would cost countless of these same loyal warriors their lives in a cause many of them may have followed more out of trust in their commander than out of any genuine conviction in his claim to the throne. Whatever calculation persuaded these warriors to follow Malekith into open rebellion against their own homeland, the decision belonged, in the end, to each of them individually, a reminder that the coming tragedy of this war would not fall upon Malekith alone, but upon every soul, loyal and rebel alike, who chose a side in a conflict whose deepest roots lay in grievances few of them had any part in creating. A particular tragedy runs through the very nature of this decision, closing off any possibility of the more sympathetic reading this story might otherwise have offered him. A prince rejected unfairly by circumstance beyond his control retains in that rejection a claim to genuine grievance. A prince who responds to rejection, however painful, by making war upon his own people forfeits whatever sympathy his earlier suffering might have earned him. Whatever injustice Malekith had really suffered across the whole of this long story, the choice to answer that injustice with civil war marks the moment his own actions, rather than any circumstance beyond his control, became the primary author of the catastrophe still to come. A further dimension of this same moment touches on how choices made under genuine anguish still carry their own moral weight, regardless of whatever suffering preceded them. Malekith had every reason, by this point in his long story, to feel that fate itself had conspired against him, birthright denied, divine judgment rendered against him in the most public and devastating manner possible, his own body sustained only by his mother's desperate and darkening power. And yet none of this genuine suffering compelled the specific choice he now made. Other paths remained available to him, however difficult: acceptance, exile, a life lived apart from the throne that had cost him so much already. That he chose war instead, over every other path still open to him, belongs to his own will in a way his earlier suffering, however real, cannot explain away in whole. The war for Ulthuan. The war that followed set elf against elf across the whole of Ulthuan, a civil conflict whose brutality and whose intimacy exceeded anything the elves had faced even in their darkest hour against the demonic tide. The war Malekith unleashed spread across the whole of Ulthuan, pitting elf against elf in a conflict whose brutality shocked even a people who had once faced down the horror of the demonic invasion that first gave rise to Aenarion's own legend. This was, in its way, a darker trial than that earlier war had ever demanded of them. Demons had been an enemy any elf could recognize as wholly other, a horror external to their own civilization that could be fought without any confusion about which side deserved loyalty. This new war offered no such clarity. Brothers found themselves arrayed against brothers, whole families divided by loyalties that split along lines of politics and personal history, rather than any clean distinction between civilization and monstrous invasion. This intimacy of violence marks civil war as a particular kind of horror distinct from war against any external enemy, however terrible. Every elf who took up arms in this conflict fought not against some recognizably foreign horror, but against kin whose face and whose history they had once known well, a violence that carried with it a weight no battle against demons, however desperate, had ever demanded of Ulthuan's warriors. Whatever cause each side believed themselves fighting for, the war itself asked something crueler of every participant than simple courage against a foreign foe. A particular anguish sets what this war demanded of ordinary soldiers on both sides, apart from whatever grand political calculations drove the war's origins. A warrior facing a demon in battle faces an enemy whose defeat carries no ambiguity, no grief beyond the ordinary cost of war itself. A warrior facing a former comrade, perhaps a cousin or an old friend from some earlier and more peaceful age, across the battle lines of this civil war face something far harder. The knowledge that victory itself would cost them something no demonic war had ever demanded. The death of someone whose face they had once known in friendship rather than in hatred. This particular horror would leave scars upon Ulthuan's whole society that no simple military outcome, whichever side ultimately prevailed, could ever heal in whole. Wars against external enemies end, however painfully, with the enemy driven back or destroyed, the wound left behind belonging to memory rather than to ongoing division. A civil war fought between kin ends instead, with the survivors still bound to one another by blood and history, even as the war itself has taught them to view each other as enemies, a wound that persists long after the last battle has been fought precisely because the two sides can never merely part ways and forget one another existed. Across the whole of Ulthuan, communities found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict whose origins trace back to a single prince's decades of festering resentment, a resentment few among the ordinary elves now dying in this war had any part in creating. This is perhaps the cruelest arithmetic any civil war demands, that those who bear the least responsibility for its causes are so often those who pay its heaviest price, called to kill and to die in service of grievances that belonged, at their origin, to figures far removed from the ordinary lives this war now consumed. The tide turns. Despite his considerable early strength, Malekith's forces, over time, found themselves losing ground as loyalist elves rallied against his ambition, the war's fortunes shifting steadily against the very conquest he had staked everything to achieve. Whatever advantages Malekith's considerable military reputation and his considerable early strength provided him at the outset of this war, they proved insufficient to secure the swift and total victory his ambition demanded. Loyalist elves, horrified by the massacre of the princes and the naked ambition this civil war now revealed beneath Malekith's long cultivated reputation for grace and gracious acceptance, rallied against him in numbers that grew as the war's true stakes became clear to every corner of Ulthuan, still weighing which side deserved their loyalty. This shift in the war's fortunes reveals something important about the limits of even considerable military reputation when set against a cause that offends too many of a people's deepest values. Malekith had spent centuries building genuine renown through genuine heroism, the rescue of a Theltoralian, the friendship with the dwarfs, victories across countless colonial campaigns. All of this earned reputation, however sincerely deserved, could not indefinitely outweigh the horror of civil war and the massacre of princes once Ulthuan's wider population came to understand what naked ambition lay beneath the composed and gracious exterior they had so long admired. A lesson worth drawing from this shift touches on the whole relationship between reputation earned through genuine deeds and the deeper loyalty such reputation can and cannot ultimately command. Malekith's earlier heroism was never manufactured or false, a fact this whole story has taken care to establish across every earlier part of his long history. But genuine heroism earned in one context does not purchase unlimited trust in every context that follows it, and the Elves of Ulthuan, however real their earlier admiration for Malekith's courage and his skill, proved unwilling to extend that admiration into unconditional support for a civil war and a massacre their own deepest values could not countenance. This limit on reputation's power matters for understanding why the war's tide turned as it did, slowly, rather than through any single decisive reversal. Elf after elf, community after community, came to weigh Malekith's genuine past virtues against the horror of his present ambition, and increasing numbers of them found the balance tipping away from the loyalty his earlier deeds had once commanded without question. As the war ground on and the tide continued to turn against him, Malekith found himself facing a prospect his earlier confidence had never seriously entertained: outright defeat, not merely rejection from the throne, but total and catastrophic failure of the whole desperate gambit he had staked his entire remaining existence upon. Imagine what this mounting defeat must have meant for a prince who had already lost so much across the whole of this long story. A throne denied by council, a throne denied by divine fire, and now a war launched in desperate answer to both of those rejections, beginning, in its turn, to slip beyond his control as well. Every earlier setback Malekith had answered with renewed effort, further ambition, a refusal to accept any single verdict as final. This war represented, in many ways, the last such effort still available to him, a final attempt to answer every prior rejection through sheer force, where patience and legitimate claim alike had already failed him. That even this final effort now showed signs of failing left him facing a question no earlier chapter of his long life had ever forced him to confront so plainly. What remained to him if even open conquest could not secure what birthright, patience, and divine judgment had all already denied him? What Malekith chose to do as this defeat drew ever nearer, and the desperate and catastrophic final act he would attempt rather than accept it, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the Sundering itself, the catastrophe that would divide the Elves of Ulthuan forever after into two bitter and warring peoples. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the Sundering itself, the catastrophe that would divide the Elves of Ulthuan forever after into two bitter and warring peoples. We have followed this story from Aenarion's own desperate defense against the daemonic tide, through a son passed over and a lifetime of glory that could never quite answer that rejection, through corruption and Inquisition and civil war, to this final and most terrible hour. Facing defeat in the war he had staked everything upon, Malekith turned at last to the one working powerful enough to still change everything, the very ritual his own father had died defending. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the Sundering itself, the catastrophe that would divide the Elves of Ulthuan forever after into two bitter and warring peoples. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the Sundering itself, the catastrophe that would divide the Elves of Ulthuan forever after into two bitter and warring peoples. The final gambit. Facing outright defeat in the war he had launched, Malekith turned to a working of such terrible consequence that no earlier stage of this whole story had prepared its listener for the desperation it revealed, an attempt to unravel the Great Vortex his own father had died protecting. As the civil war continued to turn against him, Malekith faced a defeat more total than any he had yet suffered across the whole of this long and terrible story. Every earlier setback, the Council's rejection, the Sacred Fire's judgment, had left him some further path still available, some further recourse still worth attempting. This defeat offered no such comfort. His war for the throne was failing, and with it, every remaining hope that he might yet claim through force what legitimate succession and divine favour alike had already denied him. Facing this total failure, Malekith turned to a gambit whose sheer audacity marks the true depth of his desperation. he sought to unravel the Great Vortex, the very working Calidor and his fellow mages had raised at the cost of Aenarion's own life, the ritual that held the world's excess magic in balance and kept the demonic tide forced back beyond the world's material bounds. Whatever calculation drove Malekith toward this act, whether genuine belief that only such a drastic working could still salvage his failing cause, or a final and spiteful willingness to destroy what he could not possess, the choice itself marks a betrayal of everything his father had died to secure. A particular horror sits within the specific nature of this final gambit, one that reaches back to the very beginning of this whole story. Aenarion gave his life defending the ritual that created this vortex, a sacrifice this story's first telling asked its listener to hold in mind as the foundation upon which everything that followed was built. That his own son would, in his final desperate hour, turn against this same foundation, threatening to unravel the one working that had made Ulthuan's whole subsequent history possible, marks Malekith's fall as complete, in a way no earlier betrayal in this story had yet achieved. A particular symmetry runs through how this final act inverts everything Aenarion's own sacrifice once represented. Where the father gave his life to create and defend a working meant to protect his people across every age that followed, the son now moved to destroy that same working in service of his own narrow ambition, a mirror image so exact that it seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable that this story would arrive, in time, at just this point. Every earlier chapter of Malekith's long decline, the rejection, the exile, the corruption, the violence, the divine judgment, the civil war, finds its logical and terrible conclusion in this single act. A son prepared to unmake his father's greatest gift to the world, rather than accept that the throne his father once built would never be his to claim. The mages intervene. Understanding the world-ending stakes of Malekith's desperate working, loyalist mages move to stop him, and the resulting clash of magical power would prove even more catastrophic than either side could have anticipated. Word of Malekith's intention reached Ulthuan's loyalist mages before his working could be completed, and they understood, with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, precisely what was at stake should he succeed. To unravel the Great Vortex was to risk unleashing upon the whole world the very demonic tide Aenarion had given his life to drive back, a catastrophe that would dwarf even the horror of the civil war already consuming Ulthuan. Whatever loyalty or enmity had divided these mages from Malekith across the whole course of this war, the threat his working now posed demanded a response that superseded every other consideration. The loyalist mages moved to intervene, bringing their own considerable power to bear against Malekith's attempt to unravel the ritual his father had once helped secure. This confrontation, magic answering magic, at a scale few conflicts in the whole history of Ulthuan had ever demanded, could not proceed without consequences neither side anticipated in whole. The Great Vortex itself was never designed to withstand this kind of internal assault, a working meant to hold the world's excess magic in careful balance, now caught between one side attempting its unraveling and another attempting its defense. A strain the ritual itself had never been built to bear. What followed reveals something the whole tragedy of this story has already suggested, but never stated so plainly. That magic wielded at this scale, whatever the intentions behind it, carries consequences that outrun the control of anyone who wields it. The loyalist mages sought only to prevent catastrophe. Malekith sought only to salvage his failing cause. Neither intention, however clearly held, could govern in whole what resulted. In the end, once their competing powers met, around a working never meant to bear the strain both sides now placed upon it. A lesson worth carrying forward from this particular catastrophe touches on the deepest theme this whole story has followed, since Aenarion first took up the cursed Sword of Khaine to defend the Vortex's original casting. Power of sufficient scale, wielded even by those with the clearest and most defensible intentions, does not always answer to the intentions of those who wield it. The loyalist mages who moved to stop Malekith believed, with genuine and well-founded conviction, that they acted to prevent a far greater catastrophe than whatever their intervention might itself unleash. Whether a different response, or no response at all, might have produced a lesser catastrophe than the one that, in the end, followed, is a question this story leaves unanswered, a reminder that even the most necessary and best intentioned use of overwhelming power carries risks no amount of good intention can ever eliminate in whole. The Sundering itself. The clash between Malekith's unravelling and the loyalist mage's defence tore through the fabric of reality itself, and in the cataclysm that followed, much of Western Ulthuan sank beneath the sea forever. The confrontation between Malekith's desperate working and the loyalist mage's defence produced a cataclysm beyond anything either side had intended or could have controlled once it began. Reality itself seemed to tear at the point where these competing powers met, a wound in the world answering to no ordinary law of magic or nature. Before this cataclysm exhausted itself, much of Western Ulthuan had sunk beneath the surrounding sea, a physical catastrophe that reshaped the very geography of the Elves' ancient homeland in a single terrible stroke. This is the moment that gives this whole story its name, the Sundering, a rupture that split the whole of Ulthuan's people as thoroughly as it split the land itself. Those who had followed Malekith into rebellion, and those whose homes now lay beneath the sea that had claimed Western Ulthuan, found themselves scattered and severed from those who remained loyal to the older order. A division that hardened, in the chaos and grief that followed, into something no reconciliation would ever undo in whole. A particular finality runs through how thoroughly this catastrophe closed off any possibility of easy reunion between the two halves of what had, until this moment, still been a single people. A civil war, however bitter, ends when one side prevails, leaving open at least the theoretical possibility of eventual reconciliation once the fighting stops. A land physically sundered, a homeland torn apart by the very magic meant to protect it, admits no such easy return to what came before. The Elves who survived this catastrophe would rebuild in time, but they would rebuild as two peoples rather than one, their shared home no longer capable of holding them together, even had every other grievance somehow found its way toward resolution. A geographical dimension of this permanence made reconciliation physically as well as politically impossible. Where a civil war leaves the same land for its survivors to share once more, in time, however uneasily, the sinking of Western Ulthuan removed the very ground upon which any such sharing might once have occurred. This was a wound written into the earth itself, rather than merely a political rupture that time and changed circumstance might, in some more forgiving world, have mended in time. A permanent alteration to the map of the world that ensured no future generation, however far removed from the original grievances that caused it, could ever undo, without further ruin, what this single catastrophic hour had accomplished. Two peoples forever after. From this catastrophe emerged two peoples where once there had been one, the High Elves who remained loyal to Ulthuan's older order, and the Dark Elves who followed Malekith into an exile from which they would never return, their enmity enduring across every later age. In the wake of the Sundering, the Elves, who had once called themselves a single people, found themselves divided into two distinct nations, their hostility deepening with every passing age. Those who remained loyal to Ulthuan's older order, who had opposed Malekith's rebellion and his final catastrophic gambit, became the High Elves, rebuilding their shattered homeland according to the traditions Aenarion himself had once established. Those who had followed Malekith, whether through genuine conviction or through loyalties forged across years of shared campaign, found themselves cast into an exile from which no path home would ever again present itself, becoming in time the Dark Elves, a people whose whole subsequent history would be shaped by this original and irreversible severance. This division would prove permanent in a way few other conflicts in the whole history of any people ever achieve. Ages would pass, empires would rise and fall on both sides of this ancient rupture, and still the enmity born in this single catastrophic hour would persist, passed down through generations who had never known Ulthuan as anything other than divided, who inherited a hatred whose origins lay in a single prince's decades of resentment and a single knight's catastrophic magic they themselves had played no part in causing. A particular sorrow marks this inheritance of hatred across generations who bore no responsibility for its original cause. A high elf child born ages after the Sundering, taught to fear and despise the Dark Elves across the sea, carries a grievance that began, in truth, with a council's careful decision about a single prince's succession, a decision that child's own ancestors many generations removed had no part in making. A Dark Elf child, raised to hate the homeland that cast their own ancestors into exile, inherits a wound opened by a single prince's wounded pride, rather than by any injustice done to them personally. Both children inherit a war neither chose, fought over a throne neither will ever sit upon, in service of a grievance whose original details have long since faded into legend on both sides of the divide their ancestors' choices carved into the world. One final and bitter irony is worth carrying away from this whole long story, closing the circle first opened with Aenarion's own sacrifice. The Defender gave his life to unite all of Ulthuan against a common enemy, and to secure, through the Great Vortex, a working meant to protect that unity for as long as the world itself endured. His own son's desperate final act launched against that very working in a bid to salvage a throne divine judgment had already denied him, achieved instead the permanent sundering of everything his father had died to preserve. What began as a single council's careful and well-intentioned decision to pass over one prince in favor of another ended, across centuries of resentment, corruption, violence and catastrophe, in the permanent division of a whole people into two nations that would carry their enmity forward into every age still to come. A tragedy built not from any single villain's malice, but from decades of small and reasonable choices that no one involved could have known would lead, in the end, to so complete and so lasting a ruin, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my friend.